Hi, my name is David Kelsey, and this is a lecture on credibility. So to understand credibility, it's really just based on believability, and believability is connected to the idea of justification or reasons for believing, right? So we have something being credible as far as it's reasonable to believe that thing, that person, or that claim, right? And both claims and sources can be credible, right? So you can have a claim that's more credible, one more credible than another, and also a source that's more credible than another, right? Like an expert, right? And again, it's all connected to the reasons, right? So what reasons do we have to believe this claim or this person, for example? That's basically the correlated with the credibility of a claim or a source, okay? Of course, the credibility of a claim or a source, for example, can be something that comes in kind of degrees, right? So certain claims can be more or less credible than others. Consider, for example, if I said Barack Obama wasn't born in the United States, right? Some people actually had thought that. That was kind of like a conspiracy theory that was spread around during his presidency, right? Now, if you compare that to the claim that he's a space alien, right? The claim that he's a space alien lacks a lot more credibility than the claim that he, wasn't born in the U.S., right? Still not a credible claim, but not as bad as whether he's an alien or not. Okay, so if you do have a claim that is not credible, right, then of course we want to be suspicious. We want to be cautious about believing a claim like that, right? Now, what we say is that a claim lacks credibility either if it conflicts with something that we've observed, right? So, for example, if I saw the mail being delivered earlier today, and my buddy is telling me that it's not being delivered today, right? Of course, I should be skeptical of my buddy's claim, right? And then, of course, if a claim conflicts with some other credible claim, then I would also want to be suspicious of it as well. And then lastly, if a claim conflicts with what's called our background information, then we want to be a bit cautious and skeptical about it as well, right? So your background information is your kind of your wealth of knowledge, if you will. It's everything that you know, everything that you've ever learned since you were little, right? And usually when something conflicts with all of what you know, right, you want to probably toss it out as false, right? Not always, but usually. So say, for example, somebody told you that palm trees grow near the North Pole, right? Now that's a claim that conflicts with my background information because of what I know about palm trees and what I know about the North Pole and how they don't really go together, right? Too cold for them there. Now, the thing about the background information is I can't really say where or when I learned that about palm trees and where or when I learned that they don't really grow in weather like that, but I just know it, you know? And so the idea is that when something conflicts with that, you want to be skeptical for sure about, about that kind of claim, so. Now, I did mention that we want to be skeptical, we want to be cautious if a claim conflicts with, our observations, and I gave the example of the mail, right, being delivered. But we want to be careful with observations because observations can and often do go wrong, right? You get things wrong. Say for example that you think you see someone you know, but it's really dark. It might be sort of misperception, right? You might have gotten it wrong, Or say you hear something, right, but it was super noisy, so you're not quite sure what you heard, So we have to be careful about jumping to conclusions about our observations, especially when, environmental conditions, right, can get in the way, right? In addition, say you're distracted or you're extremely tired, right? Oftentimes our observations will be mistaken in cases like that as well. In addition, we have, for example, cases where your senses are impaired, you're drowsy, you're super sleep deprived, you're exhausted, you're intoxicated in one way or another. You're obviously in those cases your observations can go wrong as well. And then lastly, me personally, I wear glasses, but anytime you're using some kind of instrument to help you make observations, those observations are only as good as those instruments are. So the other kind of hindrances to good observation as well, there's two. The first is our memory, right? Obviously, our observations are only as good as we can remember them, and our memory is oftentimes faulty, right? We have memory lapses and so on. So we have to be aware of, that as a kind of gap in observation as well as making mistakes there. And then lastly is the idea of bias. And I think this is, for me, as far as credibility goes, this is one of the most important concepts that we have to discuss in this lecture. So bias is, kind of like prejudice or favoritism, and really bias is a lot wider reaching than you might think. So we can have biases, we could, for example, have prejudices about certain people, right? But we can also have biases, for example, about things like the food we like, pizza or beer, right? We can have biases about all sorts of things. And the thing is what happens with biases is they kind of color or, in a certain sense, make our observations less objective than they might be without those biases, And I think what we want to do is we want to be careful in making observations that our biases don't impact them. So for example, say that you're extremely angry, right? Or even a better example, say that you're in love, right? You're in love with some girl, and usually when you're in those moments of love and happiness like that and joy, the world is just a little bit better, and the things that she does are really good, and compare that, right? Imagine that you and her had broken up, you weren't together anymore, something like this, right? In a moment like that joyful kind of observation, those feelings that are connected with your observations of her are gone. In fact, usually what you feel in those moments when you guys are apart and you're broken up, you've just ended a relationship is very different, right? It's kind of like, instead of feeling good about the things that she does, it's something negative, right? Things change. Your observations, the way you feel and the way you think becomes different, clouded, right? And so you have emotions coming in like joy and happiness, and then anger or sadness or frustration. All of those kinds of emotions can color our observations, can affect the way we think, and we're not so much objective and neutral anymore, right? And so we want to be careful about that kind of bias coming in, right? Those emotions coming into our observations, because they can kind of make them sort of less correct, if you will. Okay, so now just to discuss a little bit about sources and the credibility of sources, right? Of course, one source could be more or less credible than another, right? So you might, for example, have someone who has never ever lied in their life, right? Somebody who you trust, very, very much. And then, of course, you could have someone that lies all the time, that you don't trust much at all, right? And so the credibility of a source is something that comes also in degrees, right? Sources can be more or less credible than others. Now, one of the things we want to be careful with in judging the credibility of a source is making sure that we're judging it for the right reasons. So some of the things that shouldn't affect our judgment of a source's credibility are clothing, right? Just because someone is dressed a certain way, it doesn't make them any more or less credible, right? Physical characteristics such as the way, for example, their eye color, or how tall they are, right? The color of their hair, something like that. Nothing at all to do with, whether they're credible or how much, right? Also, of course, the gender of someone, or their age, their ethnicity, anything like that, their race, none of that affects someone's credibility, right? Irrelevant, right? So what then does affect credibility, right? The factors that affect credibility are things like education, right? someone is educated, on astrophysics, they have PhD, right? Then they're probably somebody who's credible, right, about astrophysics. If somebody has a tons of experience, right, being a car mechanic, say they've been a car mechanic for 20 years, then they're probably an expert as far as claims regarding cars and fixing cars go, right? Accomplishments and reputation can also affect the credibility of a source as well, right? So, for example, imagine somebody's earned lots and lots of awards, right? Or imagine somebody has a great reputation among experts, right? Take, for example, Stephen Hawking, right? One of the most credible people in physics and astronomy that there is. Well, one of the reasons he is so is because people take him to be credible, right? Smart people, right? Experts think he's an expert, and he's got that great reputation. And so, that makes him even more credible, right, as a source. Now, we can think then now that we know what makes a source credible, we can think also about, times, moments, reasons to doubt the credibility of a source, right? So a source lacks credibility when, for example, they aren't objective, when they're biased, right? If a source is biased, then we want to be very cautious about the credibility of that source, believing that source's claims, and really that's a moment where you need to ask if you can trust the source or not, right? If they have biases that are impacting their reports and so on, then probably shouldn't trust that source, right? We also want to worry about the accuracy and the truthfulness, right, of a source. So, for example, if you think that a source isn't being accurate, or you have a reason to question their accuracy, imagine somebody making an observation about what they saw, but they weren't wearing their glasses, right? Now, the last thing is, if you think, for example, that a source for some reason is lying, right? Obviously, we shouldn't trust the source either. And then the last point I have about questioning the credibility of source is if you think, for example, that they lack the required knowledge to be making the claims that they are, right? If somebody's making claims about astrophysics and yet they don't even have a degree in astrophysics, right, then you probably shouldn't trust that individual. So, okay, well, I hope you enjoyed this this lecture, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much.